On June 1st, 2025, we headed to our first camping trip of the summer in York County, South Carolina. So come with us as we spend time exploring what has been called the Charleston of the Upstate. On our third day, I made a special effort to visit the Hills Ironworks Monument, which was quite challenging due to its location on a main road and the other entrance being on private property. Next, we went to the Battle of Biggers Ferry Monument. This battle occurred on September the 25th of 1780 when General Earl Cornwallis and about 2,000 troops marched up to Camden by the Charlotte Road from Winnsboro to capture Charlotte. Cornwallis learned the partisan commander, Colonel Thomas Sumter's brigade, was camped on the east side of the Catawba River at Biggers Ferry. Cornwallis dispatched his Legion Dragoons cavalry under Major George Hanger to attack Sumter's camp. Fortunately, Sumter and his officers anticipated Cornwallis's actions and had many of their men ferried across the river. When the British arrived that evening, Sumter's men ambushed them from across the river. The skirmish lasted only a short while before the British returned to Cornwallis's camp to prepare for the immediate invasion of Charlotte. This action prevented the British from capturing area partisans who continued to pester Cornwallis and his troops in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. While the exact site of the Biggers Ferry is under the water at the south end of Lake Wylie, if you follow North Youngblood Road to the lake, it would have been about 1/3 of the way across the lake at that point. There is a historical marker on the west side of the lake on Mason Ferry Road at a subdivision on the lake. Next, we headed to the town of York. In 1767, what would be York County was in a land grant from the king to John Miller. After the land went to a Williams, it then went to a John Fergus and took on the name Fergus Crossroads. The first house was built where First Presbyterian is located by Robert Smith. This was followed by Allen Love and David McCall, the latter of which was known as the House of Entertainment. In 1785, York County and 33 other counties made up Camden's judicial district. At that time, a commission was appointed and York became the county seat and a courthouse was built. This area was chosen as it was the center of the county. The streets were named after cherished heroes like Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Roosevelt, intertwined with streets like Congress and Liberty Street. It was also during this time that the Kings Mountain veteran, Colonel James Hawthorne, became the county's first sheriff and was charged with building the stocks and a whipping post. During York's early days, outdoor markets, known as sales days, coincided with court proceedings. To help those traveling to York from long distances for court, a portable hotel emerged. It was owned by Michael Moore and Jimmy McNeil. They used their wagon, which was full of bedding and cooking utensils. Later, Michael operated the first permanent store. While the town was incorporated as Yorksville in 1841, it wasn't until 1915 that it dropped the ville and became York. The first church in York was the First Presbyterian, built in 1842. It was there that Minister Reverend William Cummings Davis helped establish a publishing house in the 1820s when Patrick Carey came to town. The Reverend even published the first newspaper known as the Pioneer. Eventually, as the paper increased, the name changed to the Yorksville Inquirer, and today it's known as the oldest weekly newspaper in South Carolina. By the antebellum period, the town boasted beautiful homes, churches, and stores that even people from North Carolina would come to patron. In the 1800s, some of the well-to-do shops in York included the Carolina Buggy Company. By the 1890s, a cotton mill emerged. The most popular hotel was built in 1852 by Dr. Rufus Bratton and Edward Ross, and was known as the Rose Hotel, which eventually had a restaurant, barber shop, billiards room, and bar. Probably one of the most important schools in York was that of the Kings Mountain Military Academy, which was operated by two 19-year-old Citadel graduates, Michael Jenkins and Ashbury Coward. Eventually, the Civil War caused the school to close. During the war, Jenkins was killed at the Battle of the Wilderness. Because he was not from York, but from Colleton County, as a brigadier general, he was laid to rest at Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston and has a huge marker. Coward did reopen the school after the war, but eventually moved on and became the superintendent of the Citadel. Like Jenkins, Coward was not originally from York, as his mother was a DuBose from Berkeley County. That being said, Coward did eventually come back to York with his wife and 14 children, and today he is laid to rest at the Rose Hill Cemetery. By 1909, a Charleston orphanage moved to York and used the former Kings Mountain Military School. Another notable citizen buried at the Rose Hill Cemetery is that of Dr. Rufus Bratton. He was the son of Dr. James Bratton, the grandson of Dr. John Bratton, and the great-grandson of Colonel William and Martha Bratton of Brattonsville fame. As a man, Rufus married Ella Love, and they had several children, of which a son named James also became a doctor. Prior to the Civil War, Rufus Bratton had a reputation as a good doctor. It was during this time that Dr. Bratton had to drill a hole in James Ramsey's skull to remove pressure after he was kicked in the head by a horse, and as a result, he lived for many more years. During the war, Dr. Rufus was a leading surgeon at the Confederate Hospital in Richmond. By the time of Jefferson Davis's attempted escape, he took refuge at Dr. Rufus Bratton's home. One of the more bizarre stories about the doctor includes him stealing the body of the wife killer George Langford and turning him into a skeleton, which he paraded through the town. Despite that, the doctor had a great reputation as being a caring physician. On July 1st of 1886, in an attempt to call on Theodore Moore, Dr. Rufus Bratton actually attempted to pick up his sick patient while Bullet Creek was flooded. During the retrieval, the horse panicked, and while the doctor was able to save his patient from drowning, his horse and medicine bag were lost. While confirming evidence was only discovered in 1993, it has always been a common oral story that Yankees did come to York looking for Jefferson and the Confederate gold. There was tale of a small scrimmage which occurred near the Smith Ford Road, now in Cherokee County. This actually occurred after the end of the war, but no one here knew that the war had ended yet. It was oral tradition that W.P. Thomas heard the Yankees were coming and that he had his slave bury all of the family's silver, after which they both hid under the house. But the slave was so large a man that he couldn't fit. When the Yankees finally arrived after pillaging the house, they found the slave, who was later spotted in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. There is also a tale of a skirmish at Thompson Plantation and at Hampton's Plantation near the old Pinckney Road. In addition, at the Colonel William Elliott White House in Fort Mill, his widow Anne used her home as a rest home for Confederate soldiers. It is said that one day a group of Yankee soldiers stopped by the home, and Anne was only able to save her house when she displayed her late husband's Masonic ring to the raiders. It was also in 1886 that the Great Earthquake was witnessed. While this earthquake was felt in Charleston at 9:50, it wasn't felt in York County until 10. Thankfully here, the earthquake wasn't as violent as it was in the Low Country. That being said, one of the homes here in York does have earthquake rods, just like the homes in Charleston. After Reconstruction, most of the county remained Democratic. That being said, by the 1930s, Carl Hambright swayed a lot of votes as his supporters, known as the Hambrighters, increased throughout the county. However, it did take until the late 1970s when the Republican Party became less radical and more conservative that the people of York changed their political leanings, many of whom believed that their ancestors were turning over in their graves over their new political stance. Between 1929 and 1944, the Barnett Brothers Circus made their winter home here, and the sound of roaring lions and trumpeting elephants filled the streets of York. When Eisenhower was calling for the young men of the nation to join the cause and fight in World War II, which was also known as the Great Crusade, many men of York enlisted. Others joined the Home Guard, and women sold war bonds. During this time, the newspaper constantly published stories and photos about the brave men who were overseas. By the late 1950s, schools began to merge, and the old white-only signs were being removed. That being said, it did take some time to go into effect here. Besides outright racism, one of the many reasons that it took so long for York County to integrate its schools was its athletic pride. This is because both African American communities and white communities fought to keep their Blue Devils basketball team in Jefferson, the Cardinals baseball team in Sharon and Hickory Grove, and the Green Dragons football team in York. However, after a heated debate in 1967, the schools were integrated, and the old mascots were finally done away with, as the county envisioned new mascots to go with their new interracial pride. By the 1970s, these new integrated athletic teams sprung up all over the county. By this time, African Americans emerged as leaders on both councils and boards, such as Juanita Higgins, Nancy Sconce, and Leela Moss. Over time, the county moved from less agricultural to more manufacturing and industrial parks. By the 1980s, York was considered to be a desirable place to work and live, and as a result, it had less poverty than all other counties in South Carolina. In the 1980s, loved establishments included Neely's Drugstore, J.R. Barnwell's Hardware, and Sylvan's Theater. Today, York has one of the largest historic districts in the state, which contains 340 acres and 180 structures and landmarks. In York County, the people of the past knew what hard work meant, a sentiment that many people in York still value today, as they raise their family in a place that has somehow completely changed, yet remains the same. Before leaving York, we went to visit yet another family gravesite. This time, it was the graves of James B. Fulton and his wife, Anastasia Toole. Their graves are located at the Old Settlers Cemetery. James was the son of Robert Fulton and Catherine Sparburn. He was a private in the American Revolution, and he married A.S. Toole on May 27th of 1787 in Montgomery Village, Maryland. Their marriage would eventually result in 9 children, of which our ancestor is their son, Daniel Ashbury Fulton. Anastasia is probably one of my most fascinating relatives, as some of her ancestors left behind very detailed lives. In fact, her own father was killed at the Battle of Germantown, and her child, Elia Pratt Fulton Featherston, became the first person in North Carolina to have a Daughters of the American Revolution gravestone. Next, we spent a little bit of time in Rock Hill. First, we tried out the 90s dessert bar and tried their viral Dubai chocolate dessert. My boy actually loved it so much that we ended up having to switch. Next, we got outside and stretched our legs by trying to find the Carhart Mansion ruins. It's hard to believe, but it's supposed to be down here at the tree line. So let's go see if we can find it. But somehow we hiked far beyond where it's supposed to be, and we found something else. I know they made it out like it was just right down the little path, but it was a little more than that. Of course, we might have took the wrong path. I don't know. I guess that was the foundation. I don't know. Looking back now, it's funny because I didn't realize it wasn't the ruins at the time. While we didn't get to see the remains of the grand estate built by Hamilton Carhart, founder of the Carhart Workwear Company, whose textile mill operated here in the area, we did have fun walking the many bike trails. Ebenezer Presbyterian is the oldest church in Rock Hill, founded after the Revolutionary War by Reverend Francis Cummings. Prior to this, the church had been known as the Indian Land Church. The Ebenezer Cemetery is beside what was Ebenezer School. The Ebenezer Cemetery has been used as a community burial ground since the beginning of the earliest church in 1785. The oldest marked grave is that of Stephen McCorkle, who died in 1790. It is believed that the rock wall surrounding the cemetery was constructed during the 1850s. Because I have not yet spoken of anyone who fought during World War I want to talk about William Buford Worthy, who is buried here. William was born on May 23rd of 1908 and passed away on October 31st of 1993 at the age of 85. William's father was Arthur Worthy. He was a private in the Spanish-American War. The Honorable William Worthy was a graduate of USC and fought in World War I as a lieutenant. William retired as the director of the Department of Commerce, Veterans Administration, and was a former York County legislator. He was also a state commander of the VFW and at one time was a national vice president of the Sons of the American Revolution, the Thomas Taylor chapter. William was the husband of Dorothy Ferris, who is also buried here. She was a local beauty queen, a Winthrop graduate, a Girl Scout group leader, and was in the DAR. By the end of our third day, we were starving. And while we ate at TC's Icy Shed on Monday and Pier 51 on Tuesday, when my mom offered to take us to eat at Bailey's Fish Camp in Blacksburg, I couldn't resist. In Blacksburg's earliest history, Whitaker Mountain was once a place of native rituals that had its own medicinal springs. Originally, Blacksburg was known as Stark's Folly, as the Charleston man who initially tried to settle it was seen as crazy as the land was very rocky. By the 1890s, the value of the land was not from what could be grown there, but what lay beyond the surface, as the area became very popular for mining iron ore. This turned Blacksburg into a boom town with new hotels and businesses. As a result, even today, Blacksburg has the nickname Iron City. After the discovery of various precious metals and minerals, the area appeared more like a wild and rowdy Old West town. In fact, during Blacksburg's history, it even had its own famous shootout, which eventually became known as the Black Station Tragedy. In the 19th century, the Black family, headed by John G. Black, a Confederate veteran, was living in the area and persuaded the CC&C Railroad Company to lay tracks through the town and build a depot. The town soon became known as Black Station in honor of John G. Black. By 1888, the town was renamed as Blacksburg. Later in Blacksburg's history, the town became more prosperous and progressive than even its now larger neighbor, the town of Gaffney. Notably, Blacksburg had the second light plant to be built in the state and was the first town in the Piedmont to have electric street lights. Blacksburg also once boasted a beautiful park on Goat Island. Most importantly to me, Blacksburg was the area where the prominent Peeler family emerged. On our fourth day, it was so rainy, but that didn't stop us from exploring Rock Hill, the most populous city in the county and the fifth most populated city in the state. Rock Hill is located along the Catawba River in the north-central section of the Piedmont. The city is very popular as it is close to Charlotte, North Carolina. At the northern limits of the city is Lake Wylie, a large man-made reservoir. Rock Hill consists of many different neighborhoods and communities. The most notable areas in Rock Hill happen to be its downtown area, which is the city's central business district, Ebenezer, which is north of downtown and is home to the Piedmont Medical Center, Oakdale, which is to the south of downtown and is home to the Rock Hill Country Club golf course, Newport, which is Rock Hill's fastest growing area and is home to the Rock Hill Aquatic Center, and Boyd Hill Historic Neighborhood, which is often considered a low-income portion of the city, but is home to the city's municipal football and soccer stadium. While some European settlers had already arrived to what would be Rock Hill in the 1830s and 1840s, Rock Hill didn't actually become a town until the Charlotte and South Carolina Railroad Company made the decision to send a rail line through the area. Originally, the railroad had hoped to build a station in the nearby village of Ebenezerville, which was squarely between Charlotte, North Carolina, and Columbia, South Carolina. When approached, however, the locals of Ebenezerville refused to have the railroad run through their village, since they considered it dirty and noisy. Instead, engineers and surveyors decided to run the line 2 miles away. According to some, the engineers marked the spot on the map and named it Rocky Hill. Some of Rock Hill's early founding families included the White family, the Black family, and the Moores. Unlike those in Ebenezerville, these families fully supported the railroad and even decided to give the Columbia and Charlotte Railroad the right-of-way through their properties. As they were the 3 largest landowners in the area, this settled the matter. George Pendleton White had the railroad build a section of line. Construction began in 1848. In those early days, John Rattery bought a piece of land on the southeast corner of what would be Main and Trade Street, later David Lyle Boulevard, for $1,600. On this property once stood a general store and a saloon for the railroad workers. This would become known as Rattery's Corner. Rattery was among those who signed a petition in 1868 for Rock Hill to become a town. He was chosen as one of the 5 men to comprise the first town council, serving as warden. The first passenger train arrived on March 23rd of 1852. A few weeks later, on April 17th of 1852, the Rock Hill Post Office opened. Now that Rock Hill had a name, a railroad station, and a post office, it began to draw more settlers to the area. Captain J. H. McGinnis built a small general store near the station in 1849 or 1850 to provide supplies for the construction and railroad workers. Templeton Black, who had leased the land to McGinnis, decided to devote some of his own adjacent land to building a larger town. He hired a local surveyor named Squire John Rhodey to organize a main street. Black sold his first plot of land along the street to Irene Ferguson for $125 a few weeks before the first post office opened. Other businessmen bought plots quickly after that. By September of 1854, Rock Hill Academy, the first school, opened. Despite its official name, most residents referred to it as the Pine Grove Academy, after the pine grove it was located in. Anne Hutchison White, wife of George White, donated the land to the school after her husband's death. The school had 60 male pupils in 1856. A school for girls was later opened in the same place. On December 29th of 1854, William Dobbs of Rock Hill was murdered by James and Newton Vickers. After being arrested, the brothers were taken to court in York, convicted, and then given the death penalty by hanging. The kind-hearted Sheriff Youngblood ended up paying John McGowan $25 to perform the act of hanging the men. Right before their execution, the sheriff offered the 2 brothers breakfast. Newton declined, But James replied, "Give me a good breakfast. I want to swing heavy today." Notably, James was known for being a very handsome man, and the sheriff did end up having to perform the executions. The first attempt to get Rock Hill incorporated into a true town was made in 1855. A petition was signed by major landholders and businessmen from Rock Hill. The petition was presented at the General Assembly on October 19th of 1855, but no action was taken by the General Assembly. Prior to 1857, the Indian Land Chronicles was Rock Hill's first newspaper. It was renamed the Rock Hill Chronicle in 1860. Prior to 1860, Rock Hill had at least 2 doctors. Prior to the Civil War, a census had been taken of the population in York County, where Rock Hill is located. Half of the district's 21,800 residents were enslaved people, who were very important to the local cotton production. The 4,379 white males in the county formed 14 infantry companies. Some of the men joined cavalry or artillery units instead. By the end of the war, 805 of these men had died, and hundreds more were wounded. Men from Rock Hill and York County were involved in many of the major Civil War battles. Due to its position on the railroad, Rock Hill became a transfer point for Confederate soldiers and supplies moving to and from the front. Since there were no hospitals, townspeople nursed sick and wounded soldiers in their homes. Eventually, refugees fleeing the coastal blockade of General Sherman's troops also came to Rock Hill. By the spring of 1862, local area farmers switched from cotton to corn in order to produce more food. 39 records show that the price in Rock Hill changed frequently during the war, reflecting both shortages and inflation of the Confederate paper money. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard set up a temporary headquarters in Rock Hill on February the 21st of 1865. He ordered that the roads to Charlotte be blocked to try to prevent General Sherman from reaching the city. However, Sherman ultimately went a different route. When General Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, it was actually a future Rock Hill resident who was responsible for waving the white flag. Captain Robert Mooresman Sims, a farmer from Lancaster County, was sent by General James Longstreet to inform the Union troops that the Confederates wanted a truce. After the Civil War, there was a huge social, economical, and political change in Rock Hill, as in other southern places. However, unlike some southern towns, Rock Hill grew as a town as it continued to take in war refugees, widows and their families, and the returning men who had left to fight in the war. The former wealthy elite sold off their land to stay afloat financially. Town life would begin to become more important than rural life. The next attempt to make Rock Hill a town was in 1868. In this petition, the townspeople claimed that Rock Hill had over 300 residents, 11 stores, 2 churches, 2 bars, 2 hotels, 2 carriage shops, 3 blacksmiths, 3 shoe shops, 1 tannery, 1 cabinet shop, and an elementary school for white girls and boys. This petition was then signed by 48 men, most of whom were relative newcomers to the area. with only a few members of the old establishment. Interestingly, larger landowners opposed making Rock Hill a town because of the taxes that it would bring. They filed a counter-proposal which claimed that there were only 100 residents and many of them were temporary. This situation was a strong indicator of the changes Rock Hill was experiencing as it transitioned from mostly farms to a business community. Ultimately, the state legislature did not act on either petition, and Rock Hill was still not incorporated. By 1869, a third petition was sent. This was only 1 year after the 1868 petition had failed. This time, there were 57 signers in favor of making Rock Hill a town, with only a few opponents. The opponents collectively owned 80% of the land that would be incorporated into Rock Hill if the petition was successful. Fortunately, they were unsuccessful at preventing incorporation this time, and Rock Hill was officially incorporated on February 26th of 1870. Most of the merchants in Rock Hill around 1870 were former Confederate soldiers. This included some who were entrepreneurs and new to the town. During this time, even the largest stores in Rock Hill were only 1 story tall, and there were still no sidewalks along the road. The first drugstore in Rock Hill opened that very year. In 1870, the Episcopal Church Our Savior on Oak Avenue was organized and built. Regardless of being an Anglican church, it was established by the few Episcopalians who lived in this part of the Piedmont. The earliest mention of fire protection in Rock Hill can be found in the Yorkville Inquirer, published on March 3rd of 1870, which briefly tells of an action taken by the South Carolina Senate a few days earlier. This action took place just 2 months after the town of Rock Hill was officially incorporated, and Rock Hill archives indicate that the company consisted of 35 members. In the late 1870s, the Rock Hill Cornet Band was an important part of city life. The band's beginnings were tied to Wade Hampton's visit during the campaign for governor. They were a 12-member group, mostly made up of Main Street merchants, who even had their own bandwagon painted gold and yellow. The Rock Hill Cornet Band was active from the late 1870s until roughly the time the United States entered the First World War in 1917. They appear to have dissolved after that. By 1880, W.M. Steele and D.P. Steele were owners of the Steele Brothers Shoe Store, which operated on Rock Hill's Main Street. Winthrop was founded in 1886 by David Bancroft Johnson as a teacher training school for women in Columbia, South Carolina. Winthrop University moved to its permanent Rock Hill, South Carolina home in 1895 and officially became Winthrop University in 1974 when it became co-ed. By 1992, it had evolved into the public university known today for its liberal arts education, strong history programs, and role in South Carolina's higher education landscape. It's hard to imagine this now, but in 1910, the college taught proper gardening methods, and it was up until the first decade of the 20th century that the college maintained dairy cows and poultry. While the school is not necessarily associated with athletics, the school has always emphasized the importance of physical activity and, even in its early days, supported women playing tennis. In addition, in 1922, a Winthrop graduate went to the Olympics and won multiple medals in track and field. Her name was Ludy Godbald. By 1888, the Rock Hill Grade School opened as the first public school in the city. While earlier schools relied on tuition, this school did not. This was thanks to Reverend James S. White, who lent money and gave land for the school's construction. Around the 1920s or 30s, the school took on the mascot of the Bearcats. This occurred over time as the school had a coach named Coach Herman Bear. It was one of his players that nicknamed him Cats. This evolved from Bearcats to today's Bearcat, which is a small raccoon-like animal from the Himalayas, known for its reddish-brown fur. In 1895, the Piedmont Tobacco Works was chartered and employed 100 workers who earned $3 a week. The business brought in 2,500,000 pounds of crude tobacco a year. In 1895, the First Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church was organized and built on Oakland Avenue. By 1899, cotton warehousing was very important to Rock Hill's economy. In 1900, the Bailey store was selling hardware, equipment, dry goods, and other merchandise downtown. On September 3, 1903, a train derailed after leaving Rock Hill and plummeted into Fishing Creek near York. 7 people died that day, and many more were injured. In 1905, the first tracks were laid for Rock Hill's first electric streetcar. It was also this year that a new post office was constructed. The building later served as a library and then an insurance agency. By 1908, the White Palace in Rock Hill was a department store that utilized 20 rooms. In 1911, the first African American baseball team was organized in Rock Hill and named the Gamecocks. During 1912, the Carolina Hotel in Rock Hill was known to be the most fashionable hotel in the county. During this time, some citizens took part in automobile racing. By 1916, a devastating flood hit the county and washed away the Southern Railroad Bridge. It was also during this year that the city hosted a large cleanup day where children were even encouraged to help clean. In 1918, the first rural police force was formed in York County, of which John Hayes and Charles Moss, both of Rock Hill, served. Between the 1910s and the 1920s, Anderson Automotive built cars in Rock Hill. Today, only 6 of these cars still exist, and one is on display at Winthrop College. In 1926, a tornado swept through Rock Hill and blew down many trees. Some even blocked the Lyle Hospital, which was on Hampton Street. On a more happy note, it was also this year that Rock Hill opened its Piggly Wiggly. By 1938, the semi-pro baseball team, known as the Bleachery Cubs, were playing ball. They were sponsored by the Rock Hill Finishing Company. Later, a group of women who worked for the company, who often got together for social activities and charitable causes, took on the name of the Rockettes. By 1948, the company employed 3,000 people. Uncommon sightings like that of the South Carolina lizard man isn't often heard of, but in 1939, Rock Hill had its own bizarre encounter with a strange beast. It was first sighted in Arcadia Mill Village, but accounts continued to come in. Some described it as the size of a small calf or gorilla. It was said to make grunting noises. One man even reported that the dark-colored beast tore off his clothes. One night, the creature was seen again in Rock Hill's Cherry Park and in the nearby village of Willowbrook. The president of the People's National Bank reported at the time that his maid refused to show up to work on time as she didn't want to leave her home in the early morning hours while it was still dark. Eventually, the newspaper confessed that they had made up the beast as there was nothing else to write about. By the time 1940 rolled around, 18 Jewish families called the Rock Hill area home. By 1953, the Kellanese Company came to Rock Hill and became a major employer. In 1960, Rock Hill had 6,000 black and 20,000 white residents. The next major event documented online about what happened in Rock Hill occurred in February of 1961 when 9 African American men went to jail at York County Prison Farm after staging a sit-in at the segregated McCoy's lunch counter in downtown Rock Hill, a location that now has the names of these activists engraved. Their offense was reported to be refusing to stop singing hymns during their morning devotions. This event gained nationwide attention as the men followed an untried strategy called jail, no bail. Rejecting bail was a way to lessen the huge financial burden which civil rights groups were facing as the sit-in movement spread across the South. As their actions gained widespread national news coverage, the tactics were adopted by other civil rights groups. The men became known as the Friendly Nine because 8 of the 9 men were students at Rock Hill's Friendship Junior College. Later, in 1961, Rock Hill was the first stop in the Deep South for a group of 13 Freedom Riders who boarded buses in Washington, D.C. and headed south to test the 1960s ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court outlawing racial segregation in all interstate public facilities. When the civil rights leader John Lewis and another black man stepped off the bus at Rock Hill, they were beaten by a mob of white men that were uncontrolled by the police. This, too, drew national attention. In 2002, Lewis, by then a U.S. congressman from Georgia, returned to Rock Hill, where he had been invited as a speaker at Winthrop University and was given the key to the city. On January 21st of 2008, Representative Lewis returned to Rock Hill again, where Mayor Doug Eccles officially apologized to him on behalf of the city for the treatment that the Freedom Riders endured that day. It would truly be impossible to talk about everything that Rock Hill offers. Some of the things that it does offer today include scenic riverfront views along the Catawba River and numerous nature trails, restaurants, and 31 parks, which are used for both national and local events. Its historic downtown consists of 12 buildings built as early as 1840, and its downtown offers dining and retail options. Whether it's outdoor recreation, learning about the area's rich history, vibrant art scene, or lively downtown, you can't go wrong with visiting Rock Hill, South Carolina. Last but not least, on our last day, we headed to Fort Mill. We spent the morning exploring the Upper Room Chapel. The chapel was designed to be a replica of the Upper Room, where Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, even that of Judas. The Upper Room was also the place where Jesus would partake in his last Passover meal before he himself would become the Passover lamb for the world. The chapel was constructed in 1982, but by 2009, the chapel had been abandoned for a long time and was on the verge of being demolished. At the news of this, a petition was signed and a group of people hoping to save the chapel was organized. Eventually, the chapel was sold to this group and it was repaired and opened once again to the public in 2011. Today, the chapel is one of the last remaining buildings of a Christian-themed park known as Heritage USA. Amazingly, at Heritage USA's height during the late 1980s, it received 6 million patrons a year and was only behind that of Disney World and Disneyland in terms of annual guests. Unfortunately, many factors led to the park's demise, including its owner, Jimmy Baker's sex scandal, the oversale of its timeshares, expansion that equaled a massive debt, the IRS revoking the park's tax exemption status, and of course, damage caused by Hurricane Hugo. Originally, Fort Mill was just an area in the Carolina backwoods, which had an ancient path used by the Native Americans. The path led to a crucial point where the Catawba River could be crossed. The area later became known as Nation's Ford. As a result, the path eventually took on the name Nation's Ford Road and was part of the longer Great Wagon Road, which settlers used to travel from Pennsylvania to Georgia. The Nation's Ford Road would not only shape early development, it would be a key artery for trade and military movement in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. In Fort Mill's early history, the area was merely a halfway point between Webb's Mill and a fort which had been constructed by the colony in the 1950s to protect their Catawba allies from the marauding northern tribes. The Catawba population drastically fell due to European-introduced diseases, primarily smallpox, which ravaged their communities in waves, like the epidemic of 1738 and that of 1759. Disease, combined with warfare and displacement, really caused their numbers to fall from 1,000 to less than 100 by the early 1800s. In 1840, a treaty was signed with the Catawba Nation, and most of the tribe was moved to a reservation on the other side of the river, near what is now the town of Rock Hill. While the inviting and patriotic Catawba were allowed to stay on their ancestral lands and got to avoid the Trail of Tears, they have been subject to losing their land. In fact, the last time the Catawba people lost their land was in 2017, when the nation had to give 300 acres to South Carolina to settle a $2.4 million debt related to school taxes and ensure that their children could continue to utilize the public schools. By the middle 18th century, William Spratt and his wife Elizabeth found themselves traveling through what by that time was known as the Carolina Upcountry. When they arrived to this area, a group of friendly Catawbas invited them to stay and live in the area. They became the first settlers in what would be Fort Mill, and some of their descendants still reside here in Fort Mill. In addition, the Spratt Cemetery, located on Brickyard Road, still stands as a testament to this early Fort Mill family. Of the people laid to rest there is Peter Harris, a young Catawba boy who was adopted by Thomas Spratt. As a young man, Peter Harris fought in the American Revolution. Of course, after the Spratts, many other Scottish-Irish families began to call the area home, and soon a small settlement was formed. Some of these early settlers had the surnames of Irwin, White, Elliott, and Garrison. Furthermore, in order to get their land, they had to negotiate with the Catawba. The original settlement was north of present-day Fort Mill, where the Nation Ford Road crosses Still Creek, and was known as Little York. It was there that there was a grist mill, store, tavern, church, and homes. In fact, it was in 1788 that the congregation of what would be Unity Presbyterian began to meet, though Unity wouldn't be fully recognized until 1793. By 1804, Unity had an L-shaped log church, but it burned. Afterwards, the church went through several other buildings, the last being built in 1881. Many of the early families were laid to rest at Unity Cemetery. Some families that can be found here include the Helms family. Of the Helms family, there is Claude Flo Helms, who was affectionately known as Bill. Bill served in the U.S. Air Force during Korea and later worked at night in the weaver room at Springs Mill. Bill was a third-degree Mason at the Catawba Lodge 56 in Fort Mill. Bill was also a long-term committee member of the Fort Mills Boy Scout Troop 108. Another person buried here is Thomas Hall. Thomas Hall was a World War I Medal of Honor recipient. His father received the award on his behalf at Confederate Park on July 20th of 1919. Thomas was the son of a grocery store owner and farmer. His Medal of Honor citation reads, "Under his skillful leadership, Sergeant Hall's platoon was stopped 800 yards from its final objective by machine gun fire of particular intensity, ordering his men to take cover on a sunken road. He advanced alone on the enemy machine gun post and killed 5 members of the crew with his bayonet, thereby making it possible for the further advance of the line. While attacking another machine gun nest later in the day, this gallant soldier was mortally wounded." Others laid to rest at Unity Cemetery include Samuel Elliott White and Elliott White Springs. Samuel was born at the White Homestead in 1837 and attended the Citadel in Charleston before signing up to fight for the Confederacy. Elliott, on the other hand, was born in 1896. He was the son of Grace Allison White and Colonel Leroy Springs. His mother, Allison, was the daughter of Samuel Elliott White, making Samuel Elliott's grandfather. During World War I, Elliott became an ace, and in 1918, while in France, Elliott was lucky enough to walk away from a one-wheeled landing. Not only was Elliott a skilled pilot during this time, but he was also a hero. He even earned the Congressional Medal of Honor. By 1932, Elliott was the president of his father's business, and remained so until his death in 1959. Like Eliot and his grandfather Samuel White, Eliot's father was also a colonel. Colonel Leroy Springs was born on the Springfield Plantation near Fort Mill. Leroy's father was Colonel Alexander Baxter Springs. Leroy's father was a lawyer, but more importantly, a planner on a large scale. Leroy's father became a state senator and was a member of the South Carolina Convention, which formed the Ordinance of Succession. Leroy became a student at UNC from 1878 to 1880. After university, he entered the mercantile business and became a salesman for a Charlotte wholesale grocery firm. This began a long, successful career in business. Leroy Springs entered textiles late in his career. He organized the Lancaster Cotton Mill, one of the largest in the South, in 1896, the Eureka Cotton Mills and the Springsteen Mill in 1899, and the Kershaw in 1904. He reorganized the two town mills of what would become the most famous location, Fort Mills Manufacturing Company, in 1905. These mills, founded in 1884 and 1889, became the central location of what grew into a dynamo in the 20th century. Leroy served as a colonel on the staff of Governor John P. Richardson from 1886 until 1890. He was the chairman of the Board of Trustees in Lancaster Grade School for a period. He was a delegate to the Democratic National Convention for 4 sessions, president of the Bank of Lancaster, the Lancaster and Chester Railway, vice president of the Bank of Kershaw, director of the Catawba Fertilizer Company, the Lancaster Cotton Oil Company, First National Bank of Camden, National Exchange Bank of Kershaw, Savings Bank of Fort Mill, the Southern Home Fire Insurance Company of Charleston, the Prudential Fire Insurance Company of Greenville, trustee of the Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York, director of the American Trust Company of Charlotte, vice president of the Columbia, South Carolina National Bank. He was a director of the Charleston, Columbia, and Augusta Railway at the time it merged with Southern Railway. He was probably officially connected with more separate corporations than any one businessman in the state of South Carolina. In 1928, towards the end of his career, he was the president of 7 cotton mill companies. Leroy passed in 1931 and turned over his textile business to his son. In regards to Fort Mill's history, by 1815, the First Methodist Church was established. Philadelphia United Methodist Church in Fort Mill can trace its roots back to 1832, when Philadelphia first appeared in the Methodist records for the Shugal Creek Circuit, evolving from an earlier Phelps Meeting House. It was named Philadelphia United Methodist Church. The church held services in a private home until 1832, and since then has been in 3 locations. Their present building was built in 1943. Interestingly, in 1967, the church had a mortgage burning ceremony. This practice was once very popular in churches as a way to celebrate no longer being in debt. By 1820, enough people lived in the area that a post office opened, and by 1830, the current town became known as Fort Mill. In 1852, a railroad was completed connecting Charlotte, Columbia, and Augusta. A rail station was built in Fort Mill. where farms from surrounding areas could bring their cotton and other crops to sell and ship. This influenced the development of commercial buildings along Main Street. Residential areas began to be built to house the local merchants. During the Civil War, the Fort Mill train depot served an important purpose as a supply point and trading post. In regards to the Civil War, there are many different opinions and views even today. That being said, virtually every eligible man in Fort Mill and throughout South Carolina donned the gray to fight for Southern independence, so the war must be talked about. After the war, many of Fort Mill and York County's men didn't return home, and those who did, if not mangled, were definitely changed. While York County was lucky enough to have not felt the flames of Sherman's torches, it too, like other places, suffered. Of the many refugees that fled to the area, the most famous was Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, with the members of his cabinet. It is documented that on April 26th of 1865, Jefferson stopped and stayed at the Springfield plantation while his staff stayed at the nearby Colonel William Elliott White homestead. Prior to leaving, Jefferson and his men held their last and final official Confederate meeting on the lawns of the Whites' place before continuing their flight south. Upon returning home, the previously mentioned Samuel Eliot White turned his attentions to several successful business ventures, including cotton production and banking. By 1873, Fort Mill officially became a town full of beautiful homes like that of the 1860 Mack Belk House and the 1869 Wilson House, which today is home to the Fort Mill Museum. In 1880, a 12-room house was built on Confederate Street. It was noticed by everyone because it had a large hickory tree growing through its front porch. In 1887, Francis Murray Mack was born. Mack was a sickly boy and didn't start school until he was 8. When he was 14, he was sent to a preparatory school in Georgia. His older sister was at the nearby Angus Scott planning to become a teacher. With his sister's help, he mastered French, Latin, and math. And as a result, he became one of the highest ranking students in both Cornell University and Davidson College. To the end of his life, Mack maintained that he was not as bright as his classmates. He just worked harder. After college, he came home to work at Fort Mill Manufacturing Company. Like all managers, like all manager trainees, he worked in various departments, weaving, spinning, shipping, and dyeing, which he hated. Around 1910, Mack joined the Fort Mill National Guard. In 1914, the Guard was sent to the Mexican border. Over 60 years later, he recalled a weekly hike from the Rio Grande to La Cruz. Fred Mims was the company's song leader, and no matter how tired, he kept them singing. Later, when the Fort Mill National Guard was under Colonel Thomas Spratt and entered World War I, a part of the famed Old Hickory Division, they became known as the Singing Company, and other companies took it up, and it was soon the Singing Battalion. And before long, marching to songs became a characteristic of the whole regiment. Mack sang a verse from one of his favorite songs, Keep your head down, Jerry boy. Keep your head down. Keep your head down, Jerry boy. We will catch the Kaiser by the tail, ride him home on a rail, for we're from Carolina, Carolina. When Mac was at basic training at Camp Jackson in Columbia, he competed for the rank of lieutenant. Most of the other candidates were graduates from military schools, but Mac had committed the manual to memory and had practiced all of the drilling orders using small sticks to represent various officer levels. He came in fourth. However, there was one thing he knew nothing about. Mac recalled, Tom Spratt told me I'm doing well, except that I handled the saber as if it were a pitchfork. Mac was made second lieutenant. Mac had been on Cornell's wrestling squad and had learned lessons in boxing. Mac was expected to drill the men, but he figured that was for open fields and not very helpful in the trenches. Instead, Mac taught the men the athletic skills he knew. He did fear that he would be court-martialed for disobeying orders. And then, unexpectedly, he was appointed first lieutenant and ordered to train the men for close combat. He said that he fell back on things that he learned as a Boy Scout troop leader. Mac and his men had a number of narrow escapes. He was gassed. This made him so nauseated that he had to get out of the convoy truck and vomit. He got back in with a splitting headache. When Mac got ready to get back in his seat, another soldier had taken his seat. The soldier offered that if Mac would sit between his feet, that he would rub his head to try and help Mac's headache. During this time, a shell struck the truck and Mac was covered with blood. The soldier sitting in Mac's old seat had been killed instantly. From 1921 to 1938, Colonel Mac was Fort Mill's superintendent of schools. He was in World War II and in 1946 to 1947 was the military governor of Taegu, Korea. Mac came back to Fort Mill in 1948 and took up farming with great enthusiasm. He had studied agriculture at Cornell. This occupied him until 1976 when he retired because of health problems. Mac passed away in 1979. Back to Fort Mill's history. It was also, in 1887, a group of local investors led by Samuel Eliot White formed a textile operation called Fort Mill Manufacturing Company. 2 textile mills were constructed, which evolved into Springs Industry. Fort Mill Manufacturing would change the fortune of the entire town. The new mill brought employment to thousands and ready buyers to cotton farms in the region. The entire town centered around the mill and transformed the area into an industrial hub. The mill era brought even more beautiful homes to the area, like that of the 1872 John M. White House, and later the 1906 Mills House. Notably, the John M. White House was used by Springs Industry for many years as a guest house. The Victorian-style residence was built by John Springs shortly after the Civil War. After Springs died, Captain Samuel White and his family moved into the house and lived there until White's death in 1911. The mansion was later renovated and restored to its original state. The mill era brought infrastructure and shaped Fort Mill's historic town. By 1889, the town had 8 general stores, a bank, insurance company, a drugstore, and a mill store. These buildings were constructed of wood and, like other towns of the time, made them susceptible to fires. Eventually, in a way to remember and honor those that he once served with, Captain Samuel White decided to donate land and money for a Confederate park and memorial. By 1891, the park opened. It is documented that when the park opened, 1,500 people gathered to attend the unveiling. Later, between 1895 and 1900, a women's monument and a faithful slave monument and Catawba Indian monument was added. These monuments put the small Confederate park on the map, as the park contains the nation's only monument to slaves fighting in the Civil War. In 1904, a gazebo, locally called the Bandstand, was constructed in Confederate Park. While outsiders have pushed for the monument's removal, according to a 2017 article in the Miami Herald, the citizens, particularly those who are descendants of the slaves in the area, are fighting to keep the park open and safe. One such slave descendant is quoted as saying, "It happened and we can't go back and change it." He feels that the monument to the slaves stands as proof of the town's atonement for the past. Others support the monument and park, as they feel it is a way to never forget those who were forced into service. By 1894, a fire destroyed 5 store buildings. The wooden commercial structures were then replaced with masonry buildings. It was also in 1894 that Captain Philip Thomas White became the principal of a black school in Fort Mill. He was a highly educated man and had even taught for some time at Friendship College. By 1896, at the age of only 30, he established the Rock Hill Messenger, which was a newspaper that was published for more than 2 decades. In 1895, Paradise, which was an African American community in Fort Mill, was established. Originally, the area was full of former slaves who settled and became teachers, masons, merchants, and entrepreneurs. The community's educational and social centerpiece was George Fish School, which opened in 1925 as the town's all-black school. Additional information regarding the Paradise community can be found in the J.B. Mills Gallery at the Fort Mill History Museum. In the 1900s, life continued to revolve around the mills, with mill villages and limited modern conveniences emerging, like that of electricity and indoor plumbing. By 1907, the mill employed 475 people. Some of those people lived in large boarding houses that were scattered around the town. In 1916, Fort Mill decorated its streets to welcome home the National Guard who had been sent to Mexico. By the 1920s to 1940s, growth declined in Fort Mill due to the effects of the Depression. But the Springs family made every effort to keep workers employed. A limited number of new buildings were constructed during this period, but several churches were constructed during this time, as well as the armory. Eventually, Springs Industry became the 4th largest textile firm in the U.S. and employed nearly 20,000 people in 30 plants. It had 24 distribution centers and 26 sales and administrative offices, 19 in the U.S., and the others being in Canada, Mexico, and even France. Of course, in more recent history, many manufacturing plants closed due to manufacturing moving overseas, and so too did the Springs plant in 2007. This was a huge blow to the local economy. However, today Fort Mill is ranked as the 7th fastest growing town in the United States. While in Fort Mill, we took time to explore the Ann Springs Close Greenway, which is a 2,100-acre nature reserve that has wide open spaces for countless activities from hiking, biking, and horseback riding to picnic, kayaking, and more. Nestled amid beautiful lakes and hardwood forest, the land has a historic tie to the Catawba Nation and the Revolutionary and Civil War, and has been permanently preserved for public use. This came about because of the park's namesake, who was the only surviving child of Elliott Springs. In her early years, Close had a German-born governess who was an advocate for children being outside as much as possible and insisted on long walks for her even as an infant. Anne grew up hiking, canoeing, horseback riding all around Fort Mill. She attended Fort Mill Elementary School through 6th grade, then Ashley Hall School in Charleston, and Chatham High School in Virginia. After high school, Anne attended Smith College in Massachusetts. Notably, as a child, Anne was a passenger on the Hindenburg, the largest aircraft ever built. Of course, this was prior to the trip where it caught on fire and was forced to land in New Jersey. Early in her life, Anne dedicated herself to improving the quality of life of those around her. She loved the outdoors and encouraged others to find joy there. In 1995, the Ann Spring Close Greenway opened. From York's Lake Wylie to the smallest U.S. town of Smyrna, to Sharon's Farmers Market, McConnell's Sweet Caroline, to the antique stores of Clover and the peaceful streets of Hickory Grove, York County has always been a special place and will continue to be a beacon for visitors for years to come, as it proves nothing could be finer than to be in Carolina.
Oh, that's a gentle baby.
This is,
That's a gentle baby.
the hen is not biting us.
No.